We're delighted to have Dr. Stephen Redd here tonight from CDC, and I'll tell you a little more about him in a moment. First, of course, the Hertog Global Strategy Initiative is a research program in the Department of History that employs historical analysis to confront present and future problems in world politics and examine how history can illuminate the future and improve decision making. So I think it's entirely very much in keeping with the theme to have tonight's speaker. We thank the Hertog Foundation and Roger Hertog for sponsorship. This series is also co-sponsored by the Center for the History and Ethics of Public Health at the Mailman School of Public Health, and we thank them for the co-sponsorship, as well as the Columbia University Global Strategy Seminar, of which this is a part. And we also thank the Mailman School Communications Office for the refreshments that hopefully you will all be enjoying and have a chance to enjoy. It's really a privilege to have Dr. Redd here tonight. He is, as you can see from your program, a Rear Admiral and Assistant Surgeon General in the U.S. Public Health Service and the Director of the Influenza Coordination Unit at CDC. And so he was actually the incident commander who directed the CDC response to the last influenza pandemic. You'll remember H1N1 from last year, from 2009, and supervised over 3,000 people in that massive and very impressive effort. He started at the CDC, as many have, as an EIS, Epidemic Intelligence Service Officer, and has had a variety of jobs at CDC before rising to his current position. And I suppose if in the next few years we have another pandemic, you will again be leading the charge. So it's really a pleasure to welcome Rear Admiral Stephen Redd tonight, who'll talk about influenza pandemics in context, and to welcome all of you.
Thanks very much, and it's a pleasure to be here to talk with you about influenza epidemics or pandemics of the past and future. For the most part, I sort of see a range of ages, but for the most part, leaders of tomorrow, I'll describe some of the challenges that we've confronted in the past, and I hope that this will be helpful to you as your careers move forward and you face similar challenges in the future. What I plan to do tonight is to review three pandemics of the past century: 1918, 1957, and then the 2009 pandemic. And I'll do two things in these reviews. The first is I'll provide some measure of context. I think that these events are often compared one against the other without a real appreciation or consideration of the events surrounding the pandemic. And I think that really is it's unfair, and it leads. These things are inherently different, but in a large way different because of the circumstances surrounding the event. And the second thing I'll try to do is communicate the uncertainty that was taking place at the time the events unfolded, both from what was happening and also the decisions that had to be made. I think in looking back, it's hard to appreciate. It's really the job of historians, I think, to remove that sense of uncertainty that was taking place and to kind of come up with the truth. But as the event is being experienced going forward, it often is unclear what's really happening and what ought to be done. Let me have the next slide. So some of the ways that I'll provide context. Before I provide the context, what I'm going to do is talk about influenza viruses, a quick review, and I think some of this may have been covered in other lectures. This is a cartoon version of an influenza A virus. These are RNA viruses. They have 8 single-strand genes, and they're known by the surface proteins, hemagglutinin and neuraminidase. You can see the blue bars there are a pictorial representation of the hemagglutinin antigen. This is the protein that binds to cells and allows the virus to enter. The neuraminidase, shown as the green blobs here, is sort of the exit, the protein that allows the virus to exit the cell. So influenza A viruses are known by their hemagglutinin serogroup and neuraminidase serogroup, and so you'll see numbers like H1N1 or H3N2 or H5N1, and these are all influenza A viruses. Next slide. There are 16 different hemagglutinin serotypes. Only 3 of those are normally circulate or have circulated ever in human populations, and so seasonal viruses up to this point have been either H1, H2, or H3, and either N1 or N2. But there are a lot of other hemagglutinin and neuraminidase influenza A viruses out there. These circulate in animals, mostly in birds, but also pigs, horses, dogs, and other animals. And the seasonal viruses have they naturally will drift. As the immunity in a human population develops to the virus, they will change ever so slightly to evade that population immunity. So they're changing every year, drifting a little bit. This is why seasonal influenza viruses have to change periodically. But influenza A viruses also have the ability, or occasionally will change very dramatically so that there's no immunity in the population. And when this kind of shift takes place, we have the possibility of an influenza A virus causing a pandemic. Next slide. So when a new combination of genetic material in an influenza virus makes itself known, the question is, does this virus have pandemic potential? The newness of the virus is a given. What that means is that there's no immunity or very little immunity in the population. But the virus also has to have the ability to transmit efficiently from person to person, and it has to be in a setting where sustained transmission can take place. So these characteristics create or identify a virus that could cause a pandemic. A pandemic, of course, is a worldwide epidemic. If it's an influenza pandemic, it's an influenza A virus, novel influenza A virus that's transmissible among humans. There are 2 things about this definition that I'd like to point out. One is that it doesn't say how bad the infection will be. So you can have by this definition, you could have a pandemic with a relatively mild a disease that's not very severe. And the other thing about this definition is that it's actually backward-looking, so that when a new virus emerges that has all these characteristics, you can't say that it's a pandemic virus until it's already spread around the world. Next slide. I'm going to move now to some of the elements of context that I'll be talking about during the talk. The first is a picture of a capital, obviously, but the political situation and the economy are things that do affect the response, and at times a response can actually have political implications. Next slide. This slide shows a modern emergency department with technology that was unimaginable in 1918 and not available in 1957. Next slide. For influenza, there are specific technologies that are available now, and in large measure hadn't been as available in the past. So the ability to make a specific diagnosis, the availability of vaccines, and the ability to make vaccines against the specific virus that's causing the pandemic, antiviral drugs, and then the supportive technologies, intensive care unit treatment, mechanical ventilation in the instance where the lungs can't do the work, and antibiotics for the bacterial complications of influenza. Next slide. We also have the ability to prepare to use these tools, and this is a picture of the Emergency Operations Center at CDC during one of our exercises where we tested our ability to respond to a severe influenza pandemic. Next slide. And ultimately, the the main determinant of even with all of these other issues, the society, the medical care, our preparations, the virus itself really determines how bad the pandemic is going to be. Next slide. We have worked at CDC on measures of measuring the severity and the transmissibility of influenza epidemics and pandemics, and we've come up with this index. You can see under the parameter column, these are things that can be measured and can be scaled. The higher the number, the worse. So the symptomatic attack rate, in an outbreak investigation at a school, what proportion of people became ill, in a household investigation, and the R0, the reproductive number, how many cases result from a single case, or does a single case produce, and then the peak percentage visits for influenza-like illness. Next slide. And similarly for the severity, the case fatality rate, hospitalization rate, and the ratio of deaths to hospitalization. Next slide. So you can scale this. These letters are arbitrary, and the grid lines arbitrary as well. The upper right is the worst, and the lower left is the least worst. And I'm going to show you where some of the seasons and the pandemics of the past have fallen on this scale. Next slide. We're going to now switch to 1918, and through this talk, I'm going to show you some videos. We'll bring some people in to talk about influenza. In this case, we're going to see some of the things that were going on during 1918. Thanks. Well, it's a little bit, we knew there was going to be a risk of the sound not working. What you're seeing is a parade at the end of World War I, and the really intending to dramatize the effect that World War I had on society in the U.S. Let me have the next slide. Okay. So what was going on in 1918? Well, the U.S. was heavily involved in World War I, massive mobilization of the population and of doctors and nurses to be in the Army, a lot of control of society as a result of the war. You can see some of the other things, airmail, trains were the main way people got around long distance travel, and a Nobel Prize for quantum physics. Next slide. GNP was $1 trillion. This is adjusted for current dollars, so 1/13 or so the size of the economy today. You can see that there was a federal deficit in 1918 with about 4 times more expenditures than intake. Largely because of World War I, and then you can see some of the other measures there as well. Butter, I guess, was a lot more expensive in 1918 than it is today. Next slide. So the technologies that were available that I showed in that previous slide, there wasn't much in 1918. Viruses hadn't been discovered. There were no antivirus vaccines. There was a lot of work being done on bacterial vaccines. We didn't have antibiotics. Antiviral drugs didn't exist. And I think mechanical ventilation was probably a science fiction kind of idea. But there were things that could be undertaken, which I'll talk about in a couple of minutes. So let's look at what happened during the pandemic. Next slide. This figure shows the non-combat related mortality in the Navy, and what it shows is fairly low mortality up until the second week in September, and then a very dramatic spike with a decline over about the next 6 weeks. Next slide. During the 1918 pandemic, around 30 million or more people in the world died. Upwards of 500,000 people in the U.S. died, and there was an unusual age distribution of those deaths. Normally, in seasonal influenza and in this figure, a pandemic that had occurred about 20 years before, very young and very old are most likely to die. In the 1918 pandemic, there was this W shape with 20 to 40-year-olds having a very high risk of death. Next slide. So on that grid that I described earlier, the 1918 pandemic is the kind of upper right outlier. You'll see more transmissible than other seasons or pandemics, and much more severe. Next slide. These are some other sort of, not exactly representative, but other years for which we could find data. You can see in that A box, the lower three are all from recent seasons of influenza. Next slide. Okay, I'm not sure. Are we going to have sound, Andrew? Why don't we go to the next slide? And I apologize for these technical difficulties. I'm especially, maybe the last one I'm going to show is from the Daily Show, and so I hope we can get that one. So we're going to move now to what interventions were undertaken, and there were things that were done. Previous slide. Different cities did different things to try to reduce transmission. And what you can see in this figure is the difference in the experience in Philadelphia and in St. Louis. In Philadelphia, an early and dramatic peak of disease, pretty rapid fall off in disease, and in St. Louis, much lower and much delayed peak mortality and lower overall mortality as well. Next slide. Because of the war in Philadelphia, there was a parade to raise money so that people would buy Liberty bonds. This took place just right at the very beginning of the virus being introduced into Philadelphia. Next slide. In St. Louis, a little bit later, based on the experience of other cities and on local leadership, a lot was done. The society was essentially closed down. If you give me another tap. These measures were put in place for a little bit more than a month. The closing order was withdrawn, and then, not instantly, but at some later point, there was an increase for the highest peak actually was delayed until that point in time. Next slide. I want you to look at the date of this paper because it's something that I think we've learned more about the 1918 pandemic in the last 10 years than in the period between the pandemic and 10 years ago. It's been really studied quite a bit more recently than it had been previously. In this is really a systematic examination of the two slides I showed you before, of looking at what different cities did and whether it did anything to reduce total mortality, the time to the peak, and the height of the peak. And the bottom line is that the earlier that these non-pharmaceutical or societal interventions were undertaken, the more effect they had on reducing excess deaths relative to places that did them later. Is a little bit less strong in overall mortality and the delay to the peak mortality. So what does all this mean? Find my notes here. So cities did things to try to intervene. These efforts were not systematic in a national way. They weren't really organized, although in some locations they were highly organized. There was no national leadership, and there was also no call for national leadership during this event. The medical and public health infrastructure just wasn't in place to do this at a national level. And I think this is really a paradox, given the severity of the event, that there wasn't more of a sort of a national recognition and response. And it may have been that the war is the cause of that. The 1918 pandemic has been called the forgotten pandemic. And I think it is true that at least in the immediate aftermath, it didn't really have a major impact on the national consciousness or on public health. So now let's move to 1957. Let's see if we can. Okay, what this is President Eisenhower giving the State of the Union address in 1958. It is in between the two waves of the 1957 pandemic, and if you could hear him, he is talking about the threat of the Soviet Union and communism. Next slide. The things that were going on in the country, largely, so the space age was beginning. The civil rights movement was in a somewhat early stage. Toyota started selling cars. There was some element of control of society, not, I don't think, quite the same degree as in 1918, but the House Un-American Activities Committee was underway, and blacklisting of writers in Hollywood was a part of that era. Next slide. You can see that the GNP had increased about fourfold since 1918. There was a federal debt, and again, there was more being expended than being brought in. The federal deficit at 12%. Average income had gone up a little bit, and then you can see the rest of those measures there. Next slide. From the medical standpoint, ultrasound was being developed. The first nuclear reactor was put in place in Philadelphia, and again, in Pennsylvania, and again, the threat of the Cold War, the Soviet Union had developed the hydrogen bomb and tested it, and the Sputnik and the space race had begun. Next slide. In the 1950s, medicine had developed quite a bit since the 1918 pandemic. Viruses had been discovered. Vaccines against viruses were in use. The polio campaign in the U.S. was just 2 years before the 1957 pandemic. Influenza vaccines had been produced. There was emerging understanding of the drift of influenza vaccines, and that they had to be updated periodically. From the standpoint of respiratory support technology, the iron lung was the best we could do. Not maybe would work for polio, but for someone with pneumonia, probably not going to have a big impact. And antibiotics were available to treat pneumonia after influenza. Next slide. Okay. We may maybe what we'll do is we'll play all the videos at the end of the talk. So this is Maurice Hilleman, who is the inventor and discoverer of most of the vaccines in use today.
57, we all missed it. The military missed it. and the World Health Organization missed it. But I saw an article, mind you, in the New York Times, which said that there were all these children were being taken to the dispensaries in Hong Kong, 20,000 people lined up. And I looked at that, they said babies had glassy-eyed stares. I said, my God, this is the pandemic. It's here. So I sent off to Japan, got virus specimens, and did quick analyses, and by George, I was able to announce to the world, and I had guts at that time. I said that there would be a pandemic which would start when school began in the fall. And it didn't let me down. The pandemic of '57 of Asian influenza began on time. But now, having had early detection, very early detection, and that alert from the New York Times, not from Science, then allowed us, I could go to the manufacturers and get them going on an immediate basis without having to go through the bureaucratic red tape. And I'd helped the manufacturers along. We had 40 million doses of vaccine by the time that the end of the year came. And it was used. That's the only time we've ever averted a pandemic with a vaccine.
Next slide. So this map shows you the spread of the H2N2 virus that caused the 1957 pandemic. First from Asia, you can see southward into Australia, Southeast Asia, eastward to Japan, and then westward throughout the rest of the world. Next slide. So this is what happened. Worldwide, 1 to 4 million deaths, and in the U.S., around 70,000 deaths. I would hate to dispute Dr. Hilleman, but I'm not sure that the 1957 pandemic was really prevented. You can see the two waves of mortality here during 1957 and then into 1958. The second wave occurred primarily in older individuals. I think also seeing this wave with different age distributions was something that we thought a lot about during the 2009 pandemic. Next slide. So the 1957 pandemic falls into this quadrant B, a lot lower level of severity than the 1918 pandemic, but more transmissible by those measures than any of the other reference seasonal epidemics. So from the 1957 pandemic, we had the ability to identify the virus and to make vaccine, and there's no doubt that vaccine prevented some disease. It's hard to know exactly, I don't think all 40 million doses were used, but it's hard to know exactly who got those doses and what amount of disease they prevented. I think that if we look back, there's an interesting contrast between the polio work done just a couple of years before and a relatively silent response to the 1957 pandemic. Public health, again with polio being a major exception, wasn't nearly as developed as it is today. The CDC had been in existence for a little bit more than 10 years, but with the exception of the polio campaign, I don't think public health was quite at the level of maturity that it is at now. And maybe some of this is just has to do with influenza, that it came, it went, there were no chronic sequelae of influenza, and it sort of passed from consciousness. It's possible that the Cold War had some effect on this, but that wouldn't explain the polio work. Next slide. So now let's shift forward to the current era, just to set the stage. And for the people who were at the session earlier, some of this is going to be quite repetitive, but there are several events that occurred in the first few years after 2000 that I think set the stage for preparing for H5N1 and then the response to 2009. The events of September 11th, and particularly the anthrax bioterrorism event afterwards and public health's response to it, I think raised some questions about the capability of public health and being able to respond to a major event in an emergency like this. In the SARS episode, the main thing that was learned is that the open sharing of information is really critical to an effective response, and was delayed several months before the world knew that there was this new virus out there. Public health, once that recognition was made, public health responded effectively using very basic infection control measures. And then Hurricane Katrina, where the inability to evacuate the population really pointed out some lack of plans and lack of ability to execute, that really showed that government, there was an important role for government as part of these emergencies. So those were all the things that were going on before the video that I hope we can show that has President Bush announcing the efforts to prepare for the next pandemic.
President George Bush called on Congress to approve a $1.2 billion plan to create enough vaccine to protect 20 million Americans against a deadly strain of bird flu. He says the U.S., as well as all nations, must take all preventive steps possible.
A flu pandemic would have global consequences, so no nation can afford to ignore this threat. And every nation has responsibilities to detect and stop its spread.
Mr. Bush said the United States must be prepared to detect outbreaks anywhere in the world.
Next slide. So in 2006, the threat of an H5N1 pandemic was just public currency. There was a made-for-TV movie in the spring of 2006. Next slide. There was reason to be concerned. This map shows cases of H5N1 in poultry and the extent of spread over just about a 2-year period of time, beginning in Southeast Asia, spreading south into Indonesia, and westward through the rest of Asia, Europe, and into Africa. This really is not something that had ever been seen before. Next slide. And there were also human cases, a relatively small number of cases, but with a mortality rate of about 2/3. And you can see that the cases, in a way, were sentinels for the disease in poultry particularly. Next slide. This event, and I think particularly the leadership from very high level, spawned a really intensive planning process with plans from the White House, from Health and Human Services, next slide, and also from CDC. And we, in the spring and summer of 2006, developed an operations plan. We had an intensive exercise program and conducted actually 5 functional exercises. So this is when we're in the Emergency Operations Center. There's information being fed in that we need to respond to, and we really helped organize us to make the decisions and to understand what information we needed to make those decisions during a possible future event. And this was very much focused on H5N1 in a 1918 type pandemic. Next slide. And we actually had some real life practice that in May of 2006 there was a cluster of H5N1 cases in Indonesia, 3 generations of transmission, all in a family. There was a lot of talk of this was going to be the pandemic. Turned out that after that 3rd generation, there wasn't further transmission. You will notice that some of these events had New York as the locus, but in March of 2007, a traveler returned from China with pneumonia, had been on a poultry farm. We thought that this was the beginning of spread into the United States. It turned out that that person didn't have H5N1, and then not very much later, a physician from Pakistan traveled to the U.S. This was at a time when it wasn't known that Pakistan had H5N1. He reported that his brother had died from H5N1. He wasn't feeling too well. It turned out that he also did not have H5N1, but this really was the kind of thing that we expected would be happening, that there'd be a sentinel event that we would respond to. I'd say that a lot of these plans were based on there's different ways of calling this, but in the UK they call it a reasonable worst case scenario. So what in the realm of possibility is sort of still possible but really bad. And there was also an assumption that this pandemic would be starting overseas, and that there'd be time to detect it before it arrived in the United States, that we'd maybe have a chance to contain the outbreak at its source, and that we'd at least have several weeks to prepare within the United States to get ready to our sort of our domestic response. But as we know, that's not what happened. Next slide. I'm now going to be relating a lot from personal experience that on a Wednesday, April 15th, at a regular meeting of the pandemic response group, one of the parts of that was that there had been a case of a virus that had never been seen before. It was a swine flu, related to swine flu, in a 10-year-old boy. It was actually identified as part of a clinical trial of a diagnostic test device that was designed to identify H5N1, also seasonal influenza. And at that time, so swine flu cases are identified every so often, and normally within a little bit of investigation, the person had been at a fair or on a farm, and that wasn't the case for this individual. But 2 days later, a second case was identified from Imperial County. So the first case was identified by the Navy in San Diego, the second case in Imperial County. We reported that information a few days later, and then on Wednesday, the 22nd, additional cases were identified from Texas, and at that time we knew that none of these cases had exposure to pigs, none had exposure to each other. We knew that this was probably something significant was going on, but these were all mild cases at the beginning. In fact, several of the cases had recovered before they were diagnosed. And then on April 23rd, that was really the big news, that in autopsy material sent from Mexico to Canada and to CDC, a number of instances of H1N1 thought related to swine flu viruses were identified, and we had a real sort of 2 different sets of information. A few very mild cases from the U.S. All the cases in Mexico had been fatal, and we didn't know if we were missing severe cases, or if Mexico was missing mild cases, or if there was some combination, or maybe it was more developed and more later in Mexico than in the U.S. To some extent, these questions I think still actually remain. Next slide. This is Rich Besser, 3 days after the detection.
Let me provide for you an update in terms of where we are today and what kinds of public health actions are being taken here as well as abroad. Today we can confirm that there are 20 cases of swine flu in the United States. We have 5 affected states. There are 8 cases confirmed in New York City, There's 1 case confirmed in Ohio, 2 in Kansas, 2 in Texas, and 7 in California. And again, as we continue to look for cases, I expect that we're going to find them. We've ramped up our surveillance around the country to try and understand better what is the scope, what is the magnitude of this outbreak.
So on that day, there were a lot of decisions that had to be made, and some of which were made. This list of the things that we had to decide, down to about the last 4, all of those took place during April, within the first week after the detection of these cases in Mexico. The contract with industry was probably in mid-May, and funding to states was something that we knew we were going to have to do. That didn't actually get executed until the summer, and then you can see these last two bullets, that the vaccination program was initiated on October 5th. But I just think back on the number of cases that were reported on April 26th and how little was known about what was going to happen. Next slide. We know that this did become a pandemic. This figure shows the estimated number of cases, so kind of extrapolation from laboratory and hospitalization information. There were 4 weeks where more than 5 million cases occurred per week. Similar to 1957, the big peak was in the fall. We did not have a winter wave in the way that occurred in 1957. Next slide. So at the end of the pandemic, the estimates for the number of cases was around 60 million, with most of those cases, or with the risk being highest in the youngest age groups. For hospitalizations, about 250,000, with a fairly even age distribution, and around 12,000, with a pretty wide range, around 12,000 deaths occurred, with the highest risk in the 50 to 64-year-olds, people that had high-risk medical conditions. Next slide. So at the end of the day, the 2009 pandemic ranks as the least severe on this scale of the pandemics that we've talked about, but more transmissible than seasonal influenza, which are those 3 in the lower left corner. Let's move now to the interventions that were undertaken. Next slide. This is Tom Frieden. I think you recognize the director of CDC.
Now, the flu vaccination program for H1N1 is going to be challenging. In a normal flu season, with lots of time for preparation, with years, even decades of practice, working with provider groups and others, we vaccinate about 100 million people over about 4 months. What we're looking at now is vaccinating as many people as want to be vaccinated in as short a period of time as possible. And there are enormous logistical challenges to doing that.
Next slide. The main logistical challenge was having the vaccine. What this figure shows, it's the same figure of cases in orange, and then in green are the deliveries of vaccine. And what you can see is, even though we started vaccinating in early October, it wasn't until late November and December that production and distribution reached. We really got to the maximum doses, and during this period of time there was a very sort of a teeter-totter between not enough vaccine and too much demand to exactly the opposite, where we had more vaccine and less demand. Next slide. So there were a lot of things done well during the pandemic. We rapidly identified the virus. We developed and distributed diagnostic reagents throughout the country and really throughout the world, so there was a foundation of of knowledge about the disease. We vaccinated around 80 million people and used something that hadn't been available in prior pandemics, antiviral drugs. Next slide. You'll see that we prevented 5 to 10 million cases through the use of vaccine, prevented around 30,000 hospitalizations with that broad range, and from vaccination alone, 1,000 to 1,800 deaths. We think about 6 million antiviral courses of treatment were used, preventing between 8,000 and 12,000 hospitalizations and 400 to 600 deaths. And if you look at the title, that's the sum, sort of taking the lowest estimate of what was accomplished. Next slide. So how did we do?
Do that, don't we have to show a certain baseline level of competence?
Yeah, well, I mean, I'd argue that we have shown a baseline level of competence. The thing is that when you show a level of competence, it doesn't become a story. It only becomes a story when there are problems. Take the H1N1 flu, for example.
Right.
We jumped on that quickly. Right. Some people criticized us for being too aggressive on it, but I think we averted a larger public health disaster, and there are many examples
that's absolutely a fair point. We're gonna, is it a commercial? So here's what we're going to do, because this happens to me all the time. We get into a nice, interesting conversation, and then Comedy Central decides they need to sell beer. And so we're going to go to commercial. We'll talk for a little bit longer.
Yeah, sure.
Next slide. So just to sum up, and maybe in a little bit of a different way, what we learned is that the work that we did before the pandemic was very important in our ability to respond, even though what we were preparing for was different from what occurred. Vaccine production was too slow, and we miscommunicated on the availability of vaccine, that we gave excessively optimistic and specific projections, and that really was very hard to overcome during the event. This everyday systems bullet, what I mean by that is that the things that were in use all the time for seasonal influenza and routine public health really formed the foundation for the public health response. So things like distributing the vaccine, we use the same system that's used to distribute vaccine day in and day out. The surveillance systems used to track the disease, the systems used to assure that the vaccine was safe, all of those things were things that happen every day. And lastly, the importance of communications. That this really was a foundation of the response, the transparent, regular, open communication of what we knew and what we didn't know. Next slide. So this is Secretary Sebelius is going to give a quick introduction to where we are headed with medical countermeasures.
To counter those threats in cities and towns across this country. But as we studied the landscape, it became clear that one area is where we needed to put a special focus on medical countermeasures. Medical countermeasures are the vaccines, antivirals, antibiotics, diagnostics, and medical equipment. In a public health crisis, they're our most direct and often our most effective defense. To reach our national stockpiles, most countermeasures travel along the exact same path. They begin with discovery in a lab. Then the discovery gets translated into a useful product. Then that product gets tested for safety and effectiveness, and then someone manufactures it. And if the process works well, there's a steady output of new countermeasures targeted at our biggest potential threats. But the closer we looked...
Okay, I'm going to translate the 5 elements of this medical countermeasure initiative. I think if you read these bullets, it might be kind of hard to know what we're talking about, but I'll decode these for you. First of all, we are partnering with manufacturers to build factories that can produce influenza vaccine and other countermeasures on demand. This is a really major initiative and will make it possible to have, going forward, much more rapid production of pandemic vaccine and other countermeasures. Secondly, NIH is working to take ideas from the idea stage to the product stage more quickly. FDA will be working to smooth that regulatory process, making sure that the products that we have are safe and effective, but making sure that they're also available quickly. There are some specific things related to influenza vaccine and influenza countermeasures in this initiative. And finally, the U.S. government is proposing to work as a venture capitalist with small companies to help them have the resources available to take innovative ideas to products. Next slide. Just to dwell for a moment on influenza vaccine production, there are really three different horizons for this work. In the short term, working to make sure that we can quickly measure the amount of vaccine in a vial. That's what's known as potency. Using modern methods to make sure that the vaccine is sterile rather than having to culture it and waiting days and weeks to make sure that it's sterile. And then making sure we've got the factories that not only, if we've got bulk vaccine, that we can put it into vials and to syringes quickly. In the medium term, moving from making vaccine in eggs, something that's been done since flu vaccines have been made, to making them in cells so that we can make much more vaccine. And then in the long term, getting to a situation where we don't actually have to grow the vaccine, but we can move to more, if growing the vaccine in eggs is a kind of an agricultural process, moving to something that's more industrial and doesn't require that growth process. Next slide. So for an effective public health response, we need, these are the elements of that: rapid detection, faster development of countermeasures, including vaccine, and if there's a need for a different kind of antiviral drug, reliable distribution and dispensing, and then the workforce to do that work. And I think another really kind of underlying capability is the ability to communicate effectively. Last slide. I want to close with where we are with H5N1, and it may seem like there's no more cases of H5N1 because it hasn't been in the news, certainly not since the H1N1 pandemic, but you can see that cases are continuing to occur. Egypt, Bangladesh, Cambodia, and Indonesia have reported cases this year. There's no reason to think that we're any less likely to have a pandemic in 2011 or 2012 than in 2006 or 2007. Close. So I just want to wrap up for a moment here, and just how do we put all this together? We've had these three pandemics. In 1918, there was little ability to respond from a medical standpoint. There were interventions undertaken at the local and individual level, but at a larger level, public health really didn't have the tools to respond that were developed later. In 1957, there were tremendous advances in medicine, so the disease could be diagnosed, a vaccine could be produced, but there wasn't a large-scale public health campaign, which is a little bit surprising given that the pandemic that was most recent to that was so severe. And again, as I've said earlier, maybe that is the nature of influenza, that it passes quickly through a community. Most cases are mild, even when some are fatal. For 2009, a lot went right, from the early detection to the sharing of reagents to make sure that we had a global picture and that countries knew what was going on in their own countries. But this delay of vaccine is part of the legacy of 2009. And you've seen that there's a lot of work underway to make sure that that doesn't happen the next time. Just kind of at a little bit higher level, I think we could expect that for the future, as our abilities to respond grow, there's going to be an expectation that we're able to respond that may even be greater than what we're able to do. And this is part of the communication revolution that's taking place. We know that we'll have to do those things that I showed as the measures of an effective response: detect, respond with products, and be able to deliver them and be able to communicate. I think we can also be sure that the next pandemic will be seen even more as a global event. That even though all these pandemics have been global, I think that there will be a global nature of it that will be greater than what we've seen in the pandemics that have occurred up to now. So thank you very much.
Thank you. The floor is now open for questions for Dr. Redd. Do we have a microphone? Okay, so just speak loudly. Okay, please stand up and just
Hi, thank you for your talk.
come forward.
I have two questions. I know that the CDC and actually the U.S. government caught a lot of flack, and actually global government in general, for actually the vaccine response in the 2009 sort of pandemic response. And it seems like a lot of economists and a lot of, I guess, the public media talked about how government over-committed to buying way too much vaccine that turned out not to be used. So how do you think sort of the government will react to the next pandemic? Would the same sort of response happen, or would something else happen in terms of what will be arranged differently for other companies, and this is the prediction of how widespread it is?
Yeah, I think that the problem with the vaccine production is really the cause of vaccine being purchased that wasn't administered, because by the time we had the vaccine, the demand for it had declined. The decision-making process is such that you have to make the decision to buy several months before the vaccine is actually delivered. I think on the whole, the work that was done was to make sure that there wasn't a situation where we could have purchased vaccine, there was demand for it, and there was disease that could be prevented. So that had a lot to do with the way the decisions were made. I would hope that we would use that same formula for the future, and that the purchase of vaccine was really, we're looking at it in that way. I think that we, not knowing what was going to happen several months down the road, it was safer to have vaccine rather than not have it.
Thank you for your presentation, Admiral. I wanted to ask about, and this is a more general question, but it pertains to rapid detection and the CDC's work in general. It seems that we spend a lot of money, for example, on national security threats like terrorism. Every time an incident occurs, a bigger incident occurs in the world, the NYPD sends out intelligence officers to investigate. We're building rocket shields and full body scanners at airports and things of that nature. And at the same time, not many people die of terrorist attacks every year. But you said 12,000 people died of the swine flu. About, I believe, 30,000 people die of seasonal flu every year. Does the CDC act in a similar way? Are there investigators that go out if a new disease occurs to investigate, take samples, and is there the same interagency cooperation between, for example, the Department of Homeland Security, the Defense Intelligence Agency, as there is when it comes to other national security?
Yeah, I think there is kind of a different construct where the work that we do in public health is done collaboratively, both within the U.S. and outside of the U.S. We monitor closely trends in disease and want to know what's going on wherever it's going on throughout the world. We work to build capacity of countries to be able to make diagnoses and determine whether something is going on. So I think there is a lot of collaboration that goes on. We do send teams to try to find out what's going on in collaboration with different countries and with with state health departments. There's probably another piece to the puzzle that's not in the landscape that you painted, that's a little bit different, in that the World Health Organization is also an important collaborator in public health, and so there are lots of people trying to know what's going on. I think also there's not the need for secrecy in the way that some of those other areas are. In fact, it's just the opposite, that the more people know everything that's going on, the better we'll all be. So I think that there's some things that we're doing that are along the lines of what you're saying, but I think the whole perspective is really different.
So would you say it stands in relation to the threat versus the efforts that are being undertaken?
So the question was
So, my comparison was, okay, terrorism, not many people die every year, but a lot of money being spent. Would you say the money being spent and the efforts undertaken to take preventive measures and detect early are in relation to the actual threat?
Yeah.
Is there more that should be?
Yeah, I guess the frame of reference that I have is among health threats. So I think there's a lot of work being done to detect events overseas. Could more be done? For sure. I don't know that we can really make these kind of comparisons across these different disciplines to sort of say, do sort of cost-benefit analyses or those kinds of things.
Thank you, sir.
Hi.
I have a question, just drawing on a couple of things that you mentioned over the course of the different pandemics, and I come at this from a historical perspective. I work on the history of medicine and health, and I was struck by your use of the language of sort of the level of social control within American society during 1918-19 and then 57 and then currently, and I'm just interested in sort of how someone who is professionally in CDC and someone coming at, from my perspective, not with an MPH or any training in that, can sort of talk about what that means, that sort of level of social control, and what's the concept of that as it pertains to the pandemic experience and also the sort of public memory of the disease, I think, too, because it has to do with that. So I just wanted to hear a little more about that.
Yeah, no, I think that's one of the themes of the talk, and I guess based on recent experience, what I would say is that there is a decreasing ability to do anything like that. Probably a good thing, but it also creates a certain amount of chaos and requires a different set of skills, I think, from public health than what might have been used or might have been available previously, which is the risk communication strategy of open communication, acknowledging uncertainty, and trying to answer people's questions to promote a degree of trust that in those prior instances there were other ways of sort of gaining compliance, I guess.
Okay, yeah, that's what I was thinking.
Okay. Should I use this? Or? My question is about bioterrorism and how we should kind of prepare for that kind of situation, because you may have more than one pathogen going around at a time, obviously. And so maybe as a country that's trying to handle one pandemic at a time, should we maybe like divide that and have like the cities be more in control of what goes on, or the states, so that they have more power on their own to take care of that situation?
Well, I think that cities and localities have a lot of authority, and in fact, that probably came out most clearly in the 1918 pandemic, maybe not altogether as a positive. I think there is a balance between a national view and global recommendations, but those have to be applied locally. And so I think there is appropriately a lot of authority at local health departments and state health departments, and that's really the way it ought to be. I think one of the things in the 2009 pandemic is we recognize that we were doing these things, but the work, the real sort of putting shots in arms and collecting specimens happened at the local level. So really the work that's done on the ground is not happening in Atlanta, it's happening where the disease is.
Can I ask a second question? Do you think that the local authorities have enough funding right now and are prepared for that kind of situation currently?
Well, I think what we've seen over the past few years is that funding for public health, both at the state level and local level, has declined with the budget environment that we're in. So I think that is regrettable, and it would be better if that weren't the case.
Thank you.
Hi. I was just curious, given how with the Asian influenza in *57, the New York Times played a key role in combating that, and then contrasting that with a couple of years ago with H1N1, how our 24-hour news machine kind of perhaps overhyped it to some extent because it needs fuel, I suppose. Do you think the press plays more of a positive or negative role today in how we deal with pandemics?
Yeah, I think that the role of the press is what it is, and it's up to us to communicate effectively and to have the press play the role that it ought to, which is to describe what's going on. It's up to us to communicate effectively what that is, what's known, what's not known. Really, that risk communication strategy that I talked about earlier. I think that there is such a demand for information that it does put a burden on public health, but I think to a large extent the media can operate as a megaphone and to amplify messages. I think that in large part that's what happened during the 2009 pandemic.
Thanks.
Okay.
And feel free, if you want to take the microphone in your hand and do a sort of karaoke question period, please feel free.
Thank you, I'll decline. This was a wonderful talk, and I just have a question about your comment about the NIH doing venture capital. Now, as you are well aware, there have been problems with vaccine manufacturers, not least the anthrax people. And as you also are well aware, there were problems with manufacturing, I think, in England in 2009. And so I'm wondering just how this venture capital is to work, because with biotech companies, usually they're unsuccessful. Very few are successful. And also, usually now, there are all sorts of licensing, sales, and the rest, and the drug development process, which goes on for many years, which of course the vaccines won't, is shepherded by big pharma. So I'm just wondering how this seed money or whatever it's to be is going to work, or is it going to follow the big pharma model and have a standard vaccine manufacturer then take over?
Yeah, well, first of all, it wouldn't be NIH as the strategic investor. So exactly how that would be set up, it would probably have to be something somewhat separate from government. I think that the idea would be that these would be products that big pharma wouldn't be that interested in. So things that a small company might have an idea and have it to a certain point where it could be taken to the next level with resources that maybe wouldn't have a market, but there'd be a need for this kind of ability to take an innovative idea to the next level. I think that the points that you're making are important ones, and whatever's done, this shouldn't be just sort of handing money over. It's got to be of benefit to the government, and really the public, to the benefit of the public in a way that wouldn't occur without it. And so that's really the idea, that there's some of these products that are getting to a certain point, but they're not able to get beyond that, and this is another way to try to goose them along. But I agree with you that things like who's making the money, and is this really a benefit to the public, are key questions.
So I think that's a really interesting question, actually, and I was just wondering, I don't know if you're familiar with Marsha Angel's work, but she's written basically that drug company research tends to be less innovative than government research. So I'm wondering to what extent we're finding small pharmaceutical firms developing innovative influenza vaccines. Just to follow up on that question. And I'm also interested in this randomized controlled trial that was conducted in 2009. I didn't realize that was
the way that the first case was discovered. So I was wondering if you could elaborate on that trial.
Sure. One of many priorities acted upon in preparing for a pandemic was to develop a test that could be used almost at the bedside, but a portable device that a hospital or a doctor's office could buy that could make a specific diagnosis of influenza within 30 minutes. And so this was a prototype device that was being used that you take a clinical specimen, put it in the machine, 30 minutes later you get a result. The result that was obtained was that there was an influenza virus. The person was infected with an influenza A virus, but it wasn't like any of the viruses, the seasonal viruses or H5N1. So according to that protocol, it made its way to CDC, and that's how the first case was identified. I have to say that in that protocol, there was a lot of discussion about whether this was the right thing to do, because there might be a lot of false positives. There'd be a lot of specimens coming to CDC that wouldn't be flu. But that's the way that first case was detected. I think, so to your first question, innovation is really critical, and I think one of the challenges is the market for these products that we have flu vaccines now. They're very safe. They're perhaps not as effective as we would like them to be, but the ability to sort of take something from an idea all the way through the process to a competitive marketplace is a really huge challenge. And there really are not a lot of incentives to do that, because there is a product that can be sold that's effective. And so that really, I think this idea of the strategic investor is to try to use market forces effectively to make the right things happen from the public standpoint, where the existing that existing balance doesn't seem to be getting the kind of products that we need.
Sir, as you know through history, when you look at strategy, military campaigns have fallen because of the high disease rates among the soldiers. Civil War, most deaths were caused by disease. When we look at contemporary national security problems, I want to know what has been going on in terms of the HIV/AIDS infection of African soldiering, which was raised as an issue of national security by the president, I believe, just a few years ago, because here's this question of what's going to happen inside these societies with high rates of HIV/AIDS infection in the military of these societies.
I wish I could answer that question, but I can't. and not, I mean, I just don't know.
Are there more questions? Don't be bashful. Feel free. After the 2009 pandemic, do you feel we're better prepared now for the next pandemic?
I think that we are definitely better prepared. I think there's a risk, though, that we sort of think we're more ready than we really are. We conducted an exercise this past March that was kind of back to the original version of an H5N1 pandemic, and I think it was surprising to many people, including me, of the things that I'd forgotten in a year, and some of them very mundane, but I do think that there is a danger of many dangers. One is of complacency, that we know how to respond to an influenza pandemic. The second is that we assume that the pandemic that we had is what we'll have in the future, and I think that's a very great risk. And I would say that probably if I was going to make one prediction, it's that whatever we think is going to happen, something different will for an influenza pandemic. And I think that the ability to sustain this as a high priority is going to be challenging.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? If not, please join me in thanking Admiral Redd for that excellent, lucid, and multimedia talk.